Have you ever noticed how silence has a texture? Not just absence of sound, but something more. A softness. A weight. Like old velvet, slightly worn from too many years of careful touch. The archivist knew that texture intimately. It wrapped around him like an old shawl, following his every step through the underground corridors that wound beneath the city. He had lived in the library longer than he could remember. Long enough that even his memories of arriving had blurred into the walls themselves. Sometimes he wondered if he had always been there. As if the library had opened its eyes one day and shaped itself into the man who now walked its endless halls. This was not a place of shelves and ladders and carts full of books. There were no fluorescent lights. No hum of air vents. No digital beeps. The library breathed slowly, like something alive but unhurried. The air was thick with the scent of paper and candle soot. Ink. Wax. A trace of lavender from an oil lamp left burning for no one but the shadows. It didn't contain bestsellers, memoirs, or textbooks. Instead, it held what the world let go of. Not history. Not facts. But the in-between things. The things people forget without knowing they've forgotten. The way a grandmother's hand once felt when brushing hair away from your forehead. The tune hummed by a stranger as they walked past in the rain. The color of a coat you always thought you hated until you saw someone else wearing it and smiling. All of it. Tiny, insignificant, fleeting. Was gathered and kept here. Preserved. Protected. And written by the archivist. He didn't write with words at first. He listened. He waited. And when the world grew still. When everything above ground slipped into slumber. A sound would rise, not loud, but clear. A memory's last breath. Somewhere, someone had forgotten something. Maybe a child stopped recalling the rhythm of her mother's laugh. Maybe an old man finally let go of the name he once whispered in his sleep. Maybe no one noticed. But the memory did. And it sent out a call. Soft as fog. Thin as a single string of music. And the archivist heard it. He would rise slowly. Feet wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't disturb the dust. And make his way toward the hall of listening. There, he would sit before a table carved of wood so old, no tree remained on earth like it. He would not light a lamp. The glow from his lantern was enough gold, gentle, never harsh. And then, he would wait. Wait for the moment the memory brushed against him. And when it did, like the brief warmth of a cat curling at your feet and then disappearing, he would take up his pen. Not a modern pen. Not even a feathered quill. A stylus, carved from bone. Its tip dipped in ink made from ash and rainwater. He would press it to a special paper, thin, strong, and slightly textured. And begin to write. Not words. Not sentences. But impressions. Soft strokes. Gentle curves. Marks that looked like nothing at all unless you listened while looking. Then, you'd hear the memory whispering back. One night. The archivist recorded the scent of bread from a corner bakery that closed 50 years ago. Not the recipe. Not the name. Just the moment a boy passed by and smiled because the smell reminded him of home. Another night. He captured the feeling of warm socks pulled onto cold feet while snow tapped gently against a window pane. No one would remember these things. But the archivist did. And because he did, they lived. Somewhere, The weight of the world remained balanced. Not by kings or clocks, but by the quiet act of remembering the small things. The library wasn't empty. Its halls were full, lined with drawers and boxes and sealed envelopes. Each one carefully marked in a system known only to him. He didn't speak aloud. There was no need. The silence knew him. Sometimes, when he passed a certain corridor, a draft would brush his cheek, and he'd hear laughter, faint, childlike, echoing from a game played long ago on a street now paved over with concrete and bus stops. He would pause, just a moment, close his eyes, and smile. The memory had settled. It was safe now. He often wondered if the world above knew. If anyone, ever, looked up from their phones or their hurried footsteps, and felt the gentle tug. That soft invisible thread. That said, someone is holding this moment for you. They wouldn't know it, of course. But sometimes, they might feel it. Like warmth in an unexpected breeze. Or the way certain shadows feel like arms. And the archivist, in the quiet of his endless task, would simply keep listening, keep writing. Because the moment he stopped, the silence wouldn't be soft anymore. It would collapse. And memory would vanish completely. There were no clocks in the library. Time wasn't measured here, not in minutes, not in hours. Instead, it passed in the way wax pools at the base of a burning candle. It slid softly along the edges of perception, never hurrying, never asking to be noticed. The archivist had long since stopped counting the years. Sometimes, he would see his reflection in a glass jar, catch a flicker of his own eyes, and they looked the same as they did decades ago. Or perhaps, time had slowed to match his breath. Or perhaps, he had become part of the library itself. The world outside rose and fell in waves. New cities, new wars, new distractions. But underneath it all, in the hollow heart of memory, he remained. He kept writing. And slowly, as the years dripped by, something began to change. The memories. They started to get louder. Not in volume, but in urgency. They trembled now. Pushed forward like lost children. Trying to speak before the wind blew them away. One night, he wrote a memory so heavy. His hands trembled for hours afterward. It was of a woman who, every year on the same date, baked a pie no one ever ate. She left it on a wooden bench in a park. And she whispered, in case he finds his way home again. The archivist wrote down the curve of the crust, the sound of leaves brushing the pie tin, the silence of the bench when no footsteps came, and when he finished, he didn't store it in the usual drawer. Instead, he carried it through 3 long corridors, past the chamber of forgotten names, and into a room he rarely used. A room with no shelves, no drawers, only a single wooden table, and a glass bell jar, under which sat one book. A book he never opened. Not out of fear, but reverence. This room was not for others. It was for him. For the things he wasn't yet ready to remember. He placed the memory under the jar, beside the book, and stepped back. The candle in that room flickered once, as if acknowledging the new arrival. And then silence returned. thicker than ever. Almost comforting. Almost unbearable. Later that week, he began noticing something else. Certain drawers were warm. Not hot. Not glowing. But gently warm. Like a teacup recently emptied. It meant the memory inside was being thought of again. By someone, somewhere. Not remembered fully. Not consciously. But felt. A widow opening an old box. And touching a sweater without knowing why. A child reaching for a melody she thought she'd just made up. A man blinking in the rain. Suddenly overwhelmed with the urge to go home. Though he didn't know where home was anymore. These echoes stirred the memories. Woke them. Gave them shape again. The archivist would sit quietly when this happened. He wouldn't write. He wouldn't move. He'd let the warmth fill the room. Because this was the miracle. The moment when something the world let go of rose back like mist. Through the cracks of consciousness. He once said aloud only once. Perhaps I'm not here to keep what's lost. Perhaps I'm here to remind the world what it still holds. No one heard him. But the candles burned a little brighter that night. There were moments when he forgot himself. When he became only hands. Only listening. Only motion. But sometimes. Late into the quietest part of night. The space between 3:04 and 3:05. Where even time pauses. He would dream. He dreamed of a lake. Still. Blue. Shivering under moonlight. A boy sat by its edge. Folding paper boats. And sending them across the surface. He never saw the boy's face. But the sound, the way the boy exhaled. The way his fingers creased the paper. Felt familiar. When he woke from such dreams. He didn't write them down. He let them drift. He didn't know why. But part of him sensed. They were already written. Somewhere deeper in the library than he'd ever dared to go. There was a hallway long and curved. He had only walked it once. On a night when the earth above had shuddered. And dust fell from the ceiling like ash. At the end of that hallway was a door with no handle. No keyhole. No hinges. He had touched it once. It was warm. Too warm. And behind it, he felt movement. Soft. Familiar. But he never returned. Not yet. He had more to write. More to keep. More to listen for. Because the world never stopped forgetting. And someone had to remember. Not everything. But enough. Just enough. It wasn't loneliness he felt. Not exactly. It was more like a permanent sense of standing at the edge of a room. Where everyone else had already left. Where the chairs were still warm. The tea still steeping in the pot. But no footsteps echoed anymore. The archivist had come to accept that most memories arrive too late. They only call out when they're about to disappear. And sometimes, not even then, some vanish in complete silence. But every so often, something different happens. A memory arrives not in panic, not in sorrow, but in quiet joy, as if saying, "Here I am. I've lasted. I remember being loved." He loved those nights most of all. One such memory came softly, like a feather floating down in candlelight. It was of a small room. In a modest home. where an elderly man would polish his shoes each Sunday morning. Not because he had anywhere to go. Not because anyone would see. But because his late wife once said, "Shoes should shine. They carry the weight of your life." And so, every Sunday, he'd sit quietly, brush in hand, thinking not of the shoes, but of her. The archivist wrote the scent of polish, the way the light curved through the blinds, and the small groan of the wooden chair beneath the old man's knees. When he finished, he did something unusual. He whispered, "Thank you," to no one. And the memory lingered longer than most, as if reluctant to leave. The library had no windows, but the archivist always knew when it rained. The sound would reach him, not through air or stone, but through paper. Certain envelopes would grow heavy, certain pages would curl at the edges, and the ink in some drawers would shine like wet glass. It was as if the memories themselves remembered the weather. One night, the rain came in waves. It tapped along the ceiling, whispered through the floorboards above, and pulsed like a second heartbeat through the walls. That night, a flood of memories arrived. More than he'd ever felt at once. He barely had time to sit before the desk, before they began to pour in. A girl laughing with a broken umbrella. A cat hiding in a music box. The final note of a song played by a man with no fingers on his left hand. Each memory so small, so delicate. He could only write a few strokes before moving to the next. He didn't stop. Didn't eat. Didn't drink. By the time the candle beside him burned down to its final breath, he had filled 100 sheets. And he felt tired. More tired than he had ever allowed himself to feel. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, slept. When he woke, something had changed. Not in the library. It still breathed its slow, ancient rhythm. But within him, he felt heavy. Not in body, but in memory. It was as if he were carrying more than just the stories of others. As if something of his own had been stirred in the night. He stood, walked to the quiet hallway that ended in the door with no handle, and paused. The door was glowing. Faintly. Not with light, but with warmth. He stepped closer. This time, he didn't hesitate. He reached out, placed both palms against the wood, and breathed. Nothing happened at first. And then, a soft click. Like a thought unlocking. The door opened inward. What lay beyond was not what he expected. It wasn't more shelves. It wasn't silence. It was a garden. A garden beneath the earth. Lit not by candles, but by something softer. A kind of light that had no source. It glowed from the petals of flowers, from the bark of pale trees, from the mist that drifted like breath through the air. And in the center of the garden, there was a table. On the table, a book, bound in cloth, threaded with gold. He stepped forward. Heart slow, breath even. The book was already open. The first page held a single line. To remember is to love something twice. He turned the next page. And there, finally, were his own memories. Not as archivist, but as boy, as son, as dreamer. As one who once folded paper boats and let them drift. He Saturday. And read. 4 hours. 4 days. Maybe for years. Time didn't matter. He read his life. Not the events. But the feelings between them. The quiet longing in a handshake. The soft ache in a goodbye. The laughter he thought he'd lost forever. When he closed the book. He wept. Not from sadness. But from gratitude. Because someone, something, had saved his story, too. He left the garden slowly. Returned to the desk. And for the first time, wrote a page of his own. He titled it, "The Man Who Held Memory Until He Became One." He folded it. Placed it in a drawer marked only with a single star. And then, he listened. But there were no ripples that night. No calls. No cries from forgotten corners. Just peace. And the feeling that, maybe, just for tonight, the world had remembered enough. The stillness held. Not an emptiness. But a fullness so soft. It felt like a blanket made of breath. He sat with it. Didn't move. Didn't even blink for a while. There were no new memories calling. No quiet threads tugging at his hands. It was as if the world, for once, had chosen to rest. And in that rest, he felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. It wasn't the absence of weight, but the presence of stillness. A kind of floating that came only when nothing needed to be held. He rose from his desk slowly, not out of weariness, but reverence. The floor creaked like an old violin under his step, each note soft and fragrant with age. He walked the library not as its keeper, but as its guest. For the first time, he allowed himself to explore. Without intention, he passed familiar corridors. The room of lost smiles. The chamber of unwritten letters. The hallway of names that were once whispers. He stopped before a shelf made of blackened wood. It shimmered faintly. He didn't recognize it. Which was strange. He thought he knew them all. He reached out and touched one of the drawers. It opened with a breath. Inside, a single object. A key. Small. Brass. Worn smooth with age. No tag. No inscription. But it pulsed warm in his palm. As if saying, "You've found me again." He didn't ask where it belonged. He let his feet carry him. Through corridors older than memory. Past doors long sealed. Until he reached one. That had always been there. But never looked important. Plain. Wood. No markings. But when he touched the key to it, the door sighed. As if it had been waiting for this moment. Across centuries. It opened inward. And the air that spilled out was unlike anything else in the library. It smelled of dreams. Not sleep. Not books. But the raw scent of dreams before they take shape. That clean, glowing scent of imagination just waking. He stepped inside. It was a room filled with skies. Not books. Not shelves. But skies. Each wall was a window to another dusk. Pink-orange glow over forgotten rooftops. Pale lavender clouds stretching across fields that no longer exist. Soft blue horizons. Endless, familiar. In the center of the room was a single chair. And above it, floating midair, a map. But not a map of geography. A map of moments. Each dot pulsed like a firefly. Each line shimmered like thread dipped in moonlight. He stepped closer. And the map pulsed in response. One thread began to glow brighter. A golden line stretching far, far back. He followed it with his eyes. It ended at a small point of light. And from that point, something bloomed. A memory not his, but one he'd once forgotten to record. He saw a young man in a train station, standing in front of a ticket booth. He wasn't going anywhere. He was waiting. Not for someone, but for a decision. The man's face flickered between confidence and doubt. He held a letter in his hand. Unsent. He watched for hours, frozen in that moment. The man never moved. Never left. He just stood there. In eternal pause. And then the memory spoke. Not with words, but with a feeling that wrapped around the archivist's heart. I was never recorded. But I was real. He blinked. The sky map faded. The room dimmed. And he was left standing in the silence once more. But he understood. Some memories were never archived. Because they were meant to find him later. When he was ready. When he could hold them. Not as a duty, but as a gift. He left the room gently. Key still in hand. Not to lock the door. But to place it in a new drawer. One labeled. Returned. That night. Back at his writing desk. He didn't write on paper. He wrote in air. Each movement of his hand stirred light, drew shapes that faded. Just after forming. He wasn't recording. He was remembering. But not just others. He was remembering what it meant to be alive. In a world where no moment is truly small. He remembered the first time he saw snow. How he opened his mouth and tried to taste it, thinking it would be sweet. He remembered the sound of his name, spoken by someone who meant it. He remembered laughter, in a language he no longer spoke. And each memory, each flicker of life, did not weigh him down. It lifted him. The room glowed. Not from flame. Not from magic, but from meaning. And for a moment, just one, he felt whole. Time, in that moment, no longer existed as something to count. It wasn't a ticking, or a turning. It was a hush. A pause so vast and gentle that it could only be called presence. The archivist stayed in that presence for a long time. He didn't try to hold it. He simply allowed it to settle around him. Like dust in a beam of morning light. He remembered now what the silence had always wanted to teach him. That nothing ever truly disappears. Not if it was ever felt. Not if it was ever real. Not even if it was forgotten. All of it lingers. Every glance. Every goodbye. Every touch that meant more than it said. And because it lingers, someone must listen. Someone must say, I felt it too. That, he realized, was why he was here. Not to capture. Not to contain. But to witness. To offer each vanishing moment. A place to rest. A place to be seen. He stood slowly. His joints humming with age and purpose. The library around him shimmered, not with light, but with attention. As if the walls were listening. As if the stones themselves were remembering. He walked to a drawer he hadn't touched in decades. Drawer 1173. Label, Unclaimed Echoes. Inside were slips of paper. Some blank. Some with half-formed impressions. Some too faint to understand. He took one. Held it to the candlelight. A phrase began to appear. Slowly. Like a sunrise through mist. She smiled when I looked away, not knowing I saw it. He closed his eyes. The weight of it settled on his chest. These were the memories that never found their way home. The ones never spoken aloud. The ones never held long enough to become stories. He made a choice. Soft and small and irreversible. He would give them voice. Not as documents. Not as archives. But as songs. Not to be heard by ears. But by memory itself. So he returned to his desk. Lit a second candle, thinner, softer. And began to read the echoes out loud. Each one, a thread. Each one. A breath turned into tone. And as he spoke, the library responded. The air grew warm. The drawers hummed quietly. The shelves seemed to lean closer. He was no longer alone in the act of remembering. He had become a chorus. Each word he spoke was a note struck on an instrument made of time. He read until the wax of both candles ran dry. And then, in the hush that followed, he felt something shift. Not in the room, but within him. A lightness. Not of release, but of return. He wasn't just remembering the world anymore. The world, somehow, was beginning to remember him. The next evening, he found a folded piece of parchment on his desk. He hadn't left it there. No drawer had been opened. No pages torn. But there it was. It read, "Thank you for keeping what I could not." No signature. No date. Just that one line. He turned it over. Blank. He held it to the light. No watermark. No trick. Just presence. He placed it in the drawer marked Gifts. It was nearly empty. Now, it held one page. That night, he did not write. He walked the halls slowly, his hand trailing along the edges of stone. The library exhaled around him. Soft and steady. He listened for ripples. None came. Not because they were gone, but because, for now, the memories were being remembered. On their own. Far above, on the surface of the world, a young woman sat in a cafe, sipping tea she hadn't tasted in years. She closed her eyes, and for no clear reason, smiled. In another city, a boy traced the edge of an old photograph, and whispered, "I think I used to know you." And somewhere, a man heard the sound of rain, and wept. Not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense that someone, somewhere, had kept his story safe. The archivist didn't know their names. He didn't need to. He only knew that they had remembered something they didn't know they missed. And that was enough. He had long since stopped asking how much longer he would stay. That question belonged to the world above. To clocks, to calendars, to doors that opened only one way. Down here. In the slow breathing of the library. Time didn't measure you. It simply held you. And in that stillness, he felt no rush to leave. No need to finish. No longing for elsewhere. Only presence. One night, he awoke to silence so deep. It felt like snow falling on dreams. He hadn't been called by any memory. There was no ripple in the air. No whisper behind the walls. But something had shifted. Something quiet and invisible. Like the moment just before a candle goes out. He sat at his desk. No candle this time. Only the faint blue glow of whatever moonless light wandered the corridors. And then, a voice. Not out loud. Not in words. But a voice inside him. It said, "You've kept them long enough. Now let them return." He didn't move at first. He had never been asked to release anything. Every drawer, every envelope, every note in the stone walls. They had always stayed. Safe. Held. But now. They were asking to go home. To return. Not to people. Not to history. But to the world itself. To the breeze. To the soil. To the pause before a stranger smiles. He nodded. Slowly. And rose. He walked to the corridor where the drawers of oldest memory slept. Some had not been touched in lifetimes. He pulled one open. The scent that rose was not dust, but warmth. He unfolded the paper. A single line. The way she turned her face to the sun, even when she was crying. He read it once more, pressed the paper to his chest, and walked to the open archway at the farthest end of the library. There was no door. Just the night. Soft. Waiting. He stepped outside for the first time in years. Maybe decades. Maybe centuries. The air kissed his face. Cool. Alive. And without ceremony. He let go. He opened his palm. The memory lifted. Not like paper. But like breath. It dissolved into the air. And the night shimmered. Ever so slightly. As if catching something it had missed for far too long. He didn't cry. But something within him loosened. And it felt like forgiveness. He returned to the library. Not as keeper. But as someone who had finally learned to share. That night, he opened more drawers. Not all. Just the ones that felt ready. He whispered each memory aloud. As he carried it to the archway. And the night took them in. Gently. Lovingly. It didn't consume them. It welcomed them. Some became part of the wind. Others drifted into the soil. And a few. A rare few. Rose into the stars. And pulsed like lanterns that would never go out. Soon, a new drawer appeared. He hadn't carved it. Hadn't labeled it. It simply arrived. Inside it. A letter. Not sealed. Not addressed. He opened it. And read. For the one who gave the world back what it didn't know it missed. No signature. Just that. He folded the letter carefully. Placed it in the drawer labeled gifts. Next to the first one. Now there were two. And so, the library changed. Not in structure. Not in rhythm. But in energy. It no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a garden. A garden of invisible roots. Quiet seeds. And slow, radiant growth. The archivist still listened. Still wrote. But not with the same weight. Now, when a memory came. He greeted it like a visitor. Passing through on its way somewhere new. He would record it. Hold it briefly. Then smile and say, "You may go when you're ready." Some stayed for hours. Some, only minutes. But none stayed forever. Because memories, even the softest ones, are not meant to be locked away. They are meant to wander, to weave themselves back into the world, to become part of the look in someone's eye, when they don't remember why they're crying, but know that someone, somewhere, once saw them. The days passed without count, not because they blurred, but because they no longer needed names. There was no Monday here. No hour struck. No season marked the change. Only the quiet rhythm of memory arriving, staying, and softly leaving. The archivist had begun to hear the echoes even when none were present. He would be shelving a slip of parchment, and suddenly feel a warmth in his chest. The trace of laughter from long ago. Not his own, but kept. He would close a drawer. And in the hush that followed, a face would flicker in his mind. A face never known, but somehow remembered. He didn't question it. Not anymore. The library had grown beyond stone and wood. It was now part of the fabric of what was. It breathed in silence, and exhaled meaning. One evening, as he dusted the farthest alcove, a narrow passage that held the drawers labeled half-memories, he found something unexpected. Not a drawer, not a paper, but a door. Small, unmarked, barely taller than a child. He knelt, ran his fingers along the frame. The wood was ancient, but warm, like it had waited centuries without impatience. There was no handle, no keyhole, just a single word etched at the center. If. He sat before it for a long time. What could it mean? Was it a memory? A question? A path? He placed a hand on the word, felt the grain of it. And then, the door opened inward. Silently. No creak. No light spilled out. Only a stillness. Thicker than before. More intimate. Like stepping into someone's unspoken thought. He entered. Inside, it was not a room. It was a moment. A suspended memory that never happened, but had always almost been. The walls were made of maybes. The ceiling of almosts. The floor a field of could-have-beens. He stood inside this fragile truth, and felt something loosen in his chest. This was a place for memories that were never lived. For all the stories people imagined, but never wrote. All the words they meant to say, but left behind the teeth. He wandered. There was a desk with a book that hadn't been opened. He opened it. Every page was blank. Until he thought something. And then, the thought appeared, written in ink. What if I had stayed that night? Another page. What if I had said yes? Another. What if I had forgiven myself sooner? He closed the book. His hand trembled. These were not just memories. They were regrets. Hopes. Unwritten endings. He understood now. This was not the library of memory. This was the room of possibility. A hidden chamber in the heart of the archive. Kept safe for those moments we carry but never speak of. He stayed in that room for a long while. Didn't write. Didn't archive. He simply listened. To the silence between the thoughts. To the ache behind the questions. And in that stillness, something changed. He no longer felt like a keeper of the past. He was becoming something else. A witness. Yes. But also a gardener. Someone who nurtured not what had been, but what might yet become. When he finally stepped out, the door behind him vanished. Not as a trick, but as a gift. He didn't need to return. It was now within him. Every time a visitor's memory arrived at his desk, he could feel not just what had happened, but what had almost happened. He treated them gently, with reverence. Because possibility, like memory, deserves to be heard, even if only once, even if only in a whisper. There came a night when the library hummed, not with voices, not with footsteps, but with life. The stones were the same, the shelves still bore dust at their edges. But something invisible had begun to stir, like an orchard blooming in the dark. The archivist noticed it first. In the candles. They flickered, yes, but not from wind. It was as if they responded to the thoughts in the room. He would glance at a drawer marked unsent letters, and the flame near it would lean gently forward, as though it, too, wanted to read. He smiled. The library, it seemed, was listening now. Not just holding, not just keeping, listening. And the memories. They changed too. They no longer arrived only as scraps of the past. Some came as stories not yet lived. Others as dreams from those who hadn't dreamed in decades. It was then he realized. He was no longer just the archivist of what had been. He had become the keeper of the in-between. One memory came one night. In the shape of a feather. Not paper. Not ink. Just a small grey feather. Floating down from the rafters above. Where no bird had ever flown. It landed on his desk. Soft. Still warm. He turned it gently. On the underside, in tiny letters. As if written by breath itself. She waited for me longer than I deserved. No name. No date. Just that line. And the quiet weight of someone's truth. He placed it in a drawer labeled Grace. A drawer that had not existed until that very moment. Soon, new drawers appeared without his carving. Stillness. Regret. Joy returned late. The smell of someone you forgot you loved. They named themselves. All he did was open them. When something arrived. The library had learned to archive on its own. With him, not through him. And with that came a strange, almost tender ache. Was he becoming less necessary? Or simply part of something larger? He didn't fear the answer. Not anymore. Instead, he sat longer in silence. Wrote less. Listened more. Sometimes. He would simply walk through the corridors. Hands behind his back. Like a gardener checking the growth of wild things. And the wild things grew. One morning, before the first candle stirred. A visitor came. Not a memory. A person. She stood at the threshold. Unsure. Hands clasped. Her coat was worn. And her eyes carried the dust of long travel. She did not speak. But in her silence. He knew. She had lost something. Something only this place could help her find. He gestured for her to enter. She walked slowly, as though afraid the floor would vanish beneath her. He led her to a quiet table near the section of almosts. She Saturday. He left her there. No questions. No explanations. Only space. She stayed for 3 days. Never spoke. Never wept. But each evening, she would leave a note in a drawer he had never opened. The drawer of things finally said. On the 4th morning, she was gone. But the drawer was full. He did not read them. They were not his to read. But he knew. The library had offered her something no person could. A mirror. That reflected not the face, but the soul. Softened and whole. And so it was now. People would come. Not many. Not often. But those who did, left lighter. Not because they were healed, but because they had been heard. The archivist, no longer only the collector, had become the witness, the silent companion to sorrow, the gentle keeper of what the world had no place for. And the library, it pulsed with something deeper than memory now. It pulsed with humanity, not the loud kind, not the kind that shouts to be seen, but the kind that whispers, even when no one listens, the kind that stays, even when time forgets, the kind that does not fade. Years passed, though no one counted. The library no longer asked for time. It asked for presence, for care, for stillness. The archivist had grown older, but not in the way the world measures age. His face had more lines, yes, but they were not from worry. They were from watching people remember themselves. Every crease held a story he never needed to tell. His hands, once full of tools and ink, now often rested quietly in his lap. Because most days, the library moved without him. Drawers opened and closed. Pages turned themselves. A breeze would sweep a paper across the room, and he would simply nod, knowing that memory had found its way home. One night, as the candles burned low, he walked the corridor of last things, a section he rarely visited, not out of fear, but because it was a place meant for the right moment. He stopped at a drawer, with no label. Strange. He had always insisted. Every drawer must have a name. But this one did not. It had only a faint imprint. Like something once written, had chosen to fade. He opened it slowly. Inside, a letter. Sealed. His name was not on it. But he knew. It was for him. He sat by the softest light, and opened the letter with steady hands. There was no ink. No script. Only warmth. Only the quiet knowing that he had done enough. He closed the letter, and placed it on his heart. For a long time, he sat like that, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Outside, a wind passed through the trees. It was not loud, but it carried with it 1,000 voices, some laughing, some whispering, some silent, all of them returning to where they began. He stood, for what felt like the last time, walked to the center of the library, not to leave, not to say goodbye, but to simply be. A single candle remained. It flickered gently, casting shadows like memories on the wall. He watched it for a while. Then, without a word, he reached out and blew. The flame disappeared. Darkness settled like a blanket. But there was no fear. Because in that darkness, everything he had held was still glowing. Not outside, not on paper, but inside the people who had once passed through. Inside the world that had slowly remembered itself. And the library, it did not end. It exhaled. It rested. It waited. Because someone else would someday wander in, searching for a name they had forgotten, a story they had lost, or a silence they wished to share. And when they did, the walls would breathe again, the drawers would open, and a single candle would light itself. Without help. Because memory never truly leaves. It simply waits to be seen.